The fluorescent lights flickered above the government cubicle farm, casting sickly shadows across the linoleum floor. The smell of stale coffee and sweat filled the air as the drone of keyboards clacking echoed through the rows of desks. Amongst the nameless masses sat Tim, a low-level government employee who had spent the last 10 years pushing papers and counting down the hours until his retirement. But one day, Tim saw something he wasn't supposed to see. It started innocuously enough, a file left open on a colleague's desk that caught his eye. Tim didn't mean to pry, but his curiosity got the best of him. The document contained details about a top-secret government project, something to do with genetic engineering and human experimentation. Tim's heart pounded as he read on, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was seeing. Over the next few days, Tim became increasingly paranoid. He felt like he was being watched, like every conversation he had was being monitored. His anxiety grew as he dug deeper into the project, discovering more and more disturbing details about the government's dark secrets. One night, as he worked late in the office, Tim heard a faint clicking noise coming from the air vent above his desk. He looked up just in time to see a small metallic object drop down onto his keyboard. It was a bug, a listening device that had been planted in his office. From that moment on, Tim knew he had to be careful. He couldn't trust anyone, not even his closest colleagues. Every day he came to work was like walking on eggshells, never knowing who might be watching or listening. But the more he learned about the government's secret project, the more he realized he couldn't keep it to himself. He had to find a way to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As Tim delved deeper into the project's files, he discovered something even more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The government had been experimenting with combining human DNA with that of animals, creating grotesque hybrid creatures that were tortured and kept in secret facilities. But the worst part was that the project was still ongoing. Tim knew he had to act fast before any more innocent lives were destroyed. He tried to reach out to journalists and activists, but every time he did, his emails were intercepted and his phone calls were monitored. He even tried to leak information anonymously, but his efforts were quickly traced back to him. One night, as he sat alone in his darkened apartment, Tim heard a knock at the door. He hesitated for a moment before opening it, but what he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. It was one of the hybrid creatures he had read about in the files. A hulking half-man, half-beast monstrosity that towered over him. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its breath was hot on his face. "Please," Tim whispered, holding up his hands in surrender. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted to help." The creature said nothing, only stared down at him with a mixture of rage and pity. It raised one massive hand, and for a moment, Tim thought it was going to strike him down. But then, to his surprise, the creature spoke. "Come with me," it growled, grabbing Tim by the arm and pulling him out into the night. They ran through the streets, the creature leading the way, its massive frame barreling through overhanging tree branches and knocking over trash cans. Tim could hardly keep up, but he knew he had to trust this strange creature if he wanted to survive. Finally, they arrived at a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. The creature led him inside, down a long corridor filled with flickering fluorescent lights and the stench of chemicals. As they descended a flight of stairs, Tim realized that they were entering one of the secret government facilities he had read about in the files. He felt a mixture of fear and excitement. This was his chance to finally uncover the truth. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, Tim's excitement turned to horror. The room they entered was lined with cages, each one containing different hybrid creatures. Some were barely recognizable as human, with fur covering their bodies and claws in place of fingers. Others had wings or tails, their bodies contorted and deformed beyond recognition. And in the center of the room stood a figure Tim recognized immediately. One of the government officials who had overseen the project. He was flanked by armed guards, their weapons trained on Tim and the creature. "So, Mr. Johnson," the official said, sneering at Tim, "you thought you could just waltz in here and expose our little project to the world?" Tim backed away, but the guards closed in on him, trapping him between them and the cages. He knew he was doomed, that there was no way out of this. But then, to his surprise, the creature at his side began to change. Its body morphed and twisted, its skin splitting to reveal something even more horrifying beneath. It was a second creature, one that had been disguised as the first, and as it attacked the guards, tearing them limb from limb with its razor-sharp claws, Tim realized the truth. The hybrids weren't the victims. They were the weapons. The government had created them to be unstoppable killing machines, to be unleashed on the world when the time was right. And now, as the creature tore through the guards and began to break the others free from their cages, Tim knew he had to act fast. He grabbed a nearby clipboard and began copying down as much information as he could, his hands shaking with fear. He had to get out of there, to expose the truth before it was too late. With one last glance at the chaos unfolding around him, Tim turned and ran, the sound of snarling creatures and gunfire ringing in his ears. He made it out of the facility alive, but just barely. He knew he had to act fast to get the information he had gathered into the right hands before the government could silence him for good. Over the next few weeks, Tim worked tirelessly to get the word out. He contacted journalists, politicians, and activists, sending them everything he had uncovered about the government's secret project. He knew it was dangerous, that he was risking everything by coming forward, but it was worth it. Slowly but surely, the world began to take notice. People began to demand answers, to call for an end to the government's experiments. And as Tim sat alone in his apartment, watching the news reports come in, he knew he had done the right thing. He had exposed the government's horrific secrets, and in doing so, he had saved countless innocent lives. But as the sun began to rise and Tim finally allowed himself to rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere, somehow, the government was still watching him, still waiting to strike. And as he drifted off to sleep, his mind filled with visions of hybrid creatures and shadowy government officials, Tim knew that the nightmare was far from over. Tim woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a text message from an unknown number. "We know what you did. We're coming for you." Tim's heart raced as he read the message. Had the government found him? Was he about to be silenced? He tried to call the number back, but it was disconnected. He knew he had to get out of there, to find a place to hide. But as he scrambled to pack his things and flee, he heard a knock at the door. It was too late. They'd already found him. With no other choice, Tim grabbed a nearby lamp and prepared to defend himself. He swung it at the door as it burst open, ready to fight for his life. But it wasn't government officials who stood on the other side. It was a group of civilians, led by one of the activists Tim had contacted. "We're here to protect you," the activist said, holding out a hand to help Tim up. "We know what you did, and we're not going to let the government silence you." Tim was overwhelmed with relief. He had expected the worst, but here were people who were willing to fight for him. Over the next few weeks, Tim stayed with the group, working with them to plan the next steps in their fight against the government. They organized protests, rallies, and marches, all aimed at exposing the truth and holding the government accountable. But as their movement grew, so did the government's response. Tim's name was plastered across the news, labeled as a dangerous criminal and traitor. He was forced to go into hiding, constantly on the move to avoid detection. And then, one day, the activist who had saved him came to him with a plan. They had a contact within the government, someone who was willing to help them bring the project down from the inside. It was risky, but it was their best chance. Tim agreed to the plan, knowing that it could mean the end of his life. But as they put their plan into action, things went wrong. The government had caught wind of their scheme and had set a trap. As Tim and the activist made their way into the facility, they were met by armed government agents. They fought back with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. And as Tim lay dying on the ground, he knew he had failed. He had exposed the government's secrets, but he hadn't been able to bring them down. But as he took his last breath, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was the contact from the government, the one who had been working with them. "We've got the evidence," the contact said, holding out a flash drive. "We've got everything we need to bring them down." Tim saw it as a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As Tim closed his eyes for the last time, he knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. When suddenly, the contact kneeled next to his head and whispered into his ear, "Your evidence will never see the light of day. You've led us to the leader of the vigilante groups." Tim's worst fear had come to reality. Not only did he fail to stop the government's evil plan, he exposed humanity's only hope in fighting back against them. The government's horrific secrets still remain hidden, and humanity's future uncertain.